Hello and welcome to the Radiate Wellness Podcast with your host, metaphysician, Reiki master, and hypnotherapist, Christy Clemens Hoffman. Each week, we will discover teachings, tips, and tools to radiate your best life ever with practitioners, authors, and luminaries to help you on your path. Wellness, joy, peace, abundance. What do you want to radiate? Hello and welcome back to the Radiate Wellness Podcast, where we radiate spiritual intelligence. And I'm joined by author Mark Vernon, who wrote a book, Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. Pretty easy. Nice. Well, thank you for joining me today, Mark.
Hey, look, well, thanks for inviting me on. I hope we can illuminate the subject and bring some of its brilliance to our conversation.
Oh, I'm so excited. Well, I have to say, let's just start off. This is like, what, the 3rd book you've written?
Actually, I've written quite a few books, but most recently, the last 3 or 4 have been quite squarely on sort of spiritual themes. Dante and the mystical side of Christianity, and now addressing spiritual intelligence.
Okay, I'm going to definitely have to have you back on to discuss some of these other books because those are fascinating topics. All right, so let's dig into spiritual intelligence in 7 steps. 7 steps, really? Wow. Okay, so let's start with how you define spiritual intelligence.
I think one way of doing it is by saying how it's different from other kinds of intelligence. So emotional intelligence is often talked about these days, and that's the ability to have empathy, to know how to navigate your inner life, the inner lives of others, how to connect at the felt level. And sometimes actually spiritual intelligence is lumped in with emotional intelligence. It's kind of emotional intelligence plus purpose or plus meaning. But I think spiritual intelligence is something different. It's not so much a kind of know how to do relating, or know how to do, say, logic, if it's rational intelligence you're talking about. It's more a kind of know that. It's knowing that there is a ground or a basis from which all our vitality, intelligence, and so on springs. And so it's given many names in different traditions. I call it the spiritual commons. And the idea there is that there's this, a bit like the sun that, radiates on all beings, regardless of whether they want it, whether they're worthy of it, how they respond to it, and so on. I think there's a kind of inner light that we can all align to. And that's what spiritual intelligence enables us to do, to kind of know that it's there and then know that our lives are part of its life and that we can flourish more by tuning in more and more with our spiritual intelligence.
Wow. Now, your background, you're a psychotherapist and commentator, as well as an author. And yes, I saw you've written several books. So how do you feel your psychology background contributes to this spiritual intelligence?
Yeah, well, my interest in spiritual intelligence partly arose from the psychotherapeutic work and returning to actually a problem that has been long recognized in psychotherapy. Even Sigmund Freud discussed it, which is how you know when psychotherapy comes to an end. When is, when's enough psychotherapy? And actually, this isn't just an issue for psychotherapy. All sorts of workshops, wellness pursuits, religious pursuits too, church-going, temple-going. If you're not careful, you can get sort of caught in a cycle where you keep repeating more or less the same thing time and time again. And there's always, as it were, another stone to unturn in the psyche, always another technique to practice to see what it brings. But is there an end to this? And by end, I don't necessarily mean that it stops, but that it has a wider goal than just itself. And I think that's what spiritual intelligence tells us, that, if you like, we need to work on ourselves, but whilst part of working on oneself is to maybe bring more peace or contentment, even happiness into life, another goal for that is to enable us not to be so preoccupied with ourselves in the small sense, and then we can start to see a wider world, a wider life. And psychotherapy can help do that very much, because it can help us understand what's happened to us in the past, say, or how we're repeating things in the present. And then with that insight, you're able to just to let go a bit of what is most immediately probably bothering you, and start to feel a wider life in the spaces around that emerge. And spiritual intelligence is alert to that. It's the feeling of timelessness, rather than just being on a sort of repeat loop in your life.
Right. I mean, just as we could get along without emotional intelligence, and many people I think do, we could get along without spiritual intelligence. But what does the spiritual intelligence bring to our lives?
It grounds things, it roots things. People do obviously get along, certainly without thinking about spiritual intelligence, and maybe even without it. But I think that, for example, rampant consumerism is one result of a life without spiritual intelligence, because instead of knowing that there's an all that can be shared and participated in around us, it thinks that the way to live is just to have more and more and more and more stuff. And so, the life that's the pursuit of accumulation rather than participation powerfully dominates in the Western world, I think, because we've lost, certainly at a social level, a sense of spiritual intelligence, which our forebears, clearly had.
Right. Now, is spiritual intelligence, is this an innately human thing?
I think it certainly is innate to human beings. I think that other Homo species before us, like Homo neanderthals, probably had a form of spiritual intelligence as well, perhaps a little bit less conscious than Homo sapiens. But I imagine that all animals, creatures, maybe even plants as well, have it in their own way, perhaps as instinct, perhaps as the unconscious sharing in life. But somehow, you wouldn't say no, but nonetheless somehow do share in that vitality that's the source of all vitality. It's why you can feel the inner life of a creature, for example, but also the presence of a forest. They have something palpable about them as well, and that is because I think they're another manifestation of what spiritual intelligence knows. The difference for us is that we can talk about it, we know about it in a self-conscious way, and so can explore it in a more active, engaged way.
Right. How do you feel spiritual intelligence guides human evolution, or does it?
I think it's the distinctive feature of human evolution. And it's not just me saying this. I think actually that there is real evidence coming out of evolutionary science now.
Really?
The standard big history, as they're called, for Homo sapiens is one that's stripped of the spiritual. It's very utilitarian. It's all about adaptation and survival. And there's a number of very big selling books that tell this story. But there's a new science coming through. And again, it's not actually even that marginal. I was involved in a project with a professor at Oxford University called Robin Dunbar, who's pursuing this. And there's other scientists as well. And what they're arguing is that actually our curiosity, our felt awareness of inner life was absolutely seminal to Homo sapiens with their emergence, 200,000 years ago, say. And that it was, for example, the use of fire not just to keep warm, but the realization that with fire, we could not just be confined to the night and day as controlled, if you like, or as brought about by the rising and setting of the sun, but that we could begin to have light in the otherwise dark parts of the day. And that is a very fascinating power, to be able to start to shape and mold the day and the night. It invites you to think about, what are you doing? Is this a power that belongs to the gods, or is it one that human beings can share in, co-create with in some way? And where are the limits, where are the dangers of this divine-like power that we have? And, hence, as far back as we can see, Homo sapiens have always told myths. They've always had rituals. They've always regarded some things as holy and sacred, and therefore, needing to be related to with care. And things like fire are always at the start of that. So I think this is evidence that engagement with life was central and fundamental to Homo sapiens going all the way back. And as I say, some evolutionary scientists are now really onto this and realizing that the sort of dead materialist accounts don't really do the job.
This is fascinating. So we've mentioned the evolutionary science, but what about biological science? Does that indicate a spiritual intelligence as well?
I mean, I guess that biology is more straightforwardly defined without spiritual intelligence. The so-called natural sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology are inclined to operate with that already stripped out. But when you think about what the biological sciences have got to describe, much like what the physical sciences have got to describe, things start to look much more porous around the edges. And so if you think about evolution, again, evolution is normally told as the kind of random mutations at the genetic level that the biological organism then either incorporates because they're selected for survival, or discards because they don't aid survival. But evolution is not so random as it seems. For example, many features of very different biological organisms actually repeat. And one of the best known examples now is that we human beings have binocular vision, binocular eyes with lenses and retinas at the back and so on. And they're almost identical to look at as octopus eyes. And yet they evolved along completely different pathways. And another really important, I think, professor at Cambridge University this time of evolutionary science called Simon Conway Morris, he and now many others have identified, I think, even tens of thousands of these so-called convergences, where very different evolutionary pathways lead to the same biological solutions. Mm-hmm. Another really fun one is that saber-toothed tigers, which you probably drew when you were at school. Well, there's at least 7 different types of saber-toothed tiger that evolve completely independently across evolutionary time, and yet those teeth appeared because they do a good job biologically in a certain kind of way. And that's all very well for the physical organism. I'm getting there. There's a bit of a long explanation. And that's all very well for the physical organism. But for we human beings, part of our evolution is also our mental life, our inner life. Right. And we have a sense for what's good, beautiful, and true, for example. And we long to be part of groups and societies, and we use language in order to communicate. These are immaterial facets of our evolution. And someone like Simon Conway Morris would say that too is as much a convergence, a kind of meeting the wider reality. And so the upshot is that evolution, even biological evolution, can be seen as a kind of search engine. This is sometimes how it's put, that's exploring nature, exploring reality. And we're doing that quite as much with our inner lives and our immaterial delights, such as talking, such as longing for what's good and beautiful and true, as physical elements within ourselves. And so I think as well that as a more enriched biological story of who we are gets told, so the spiritual element will become part of that.
Okay, I'm just fascinated. This is so interesting to me. Okay, so spiritual intelligence. We understand more of what that is, how it sounds almost like we've got a human drive toward it anyway, and part of our development and evolution. Is spiritual intelligence, is it religious?
It's certainly become religious in many, many cases.
Yeah.
I think that the way that this is studied in deep human history is not through formal religions, which, didn't really exist until relatively recently, maybe the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, but through ritual and through myth, through those various facets that get sort of drawn together and tied up in one particular religion. So a religion like Christianity is a whole bunch of rituals, a whole bunch of myths that are given a kind of coherence around a story, a grand story of the one God coming to humankind in human form and so on. But before those big stories that we would call religion were brought together, all sorts of practices, often associated with places, would have coexisted. And you still get that a bit. I mean, if you read the older bits of the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh is said to live on Mount Zion, with the implication that if you're in another place at a different mountain, there'd be a different God there. And I think that's a very old, intuitive way of experiencing the spiritual, that as human society has got bigger, and the means of talking about these things even has kind of spread and cohered. So religion, as we tend to think of it, has formed. So it's just the latest manifestation, if you like, of spiritual intelligence.
Fascinating. Okay. So how can we develop spiritual intelligence? I mean, is it really as simple as 7 steps?
So the 7 steps in my book they're really kind of looking at 7 aspects of our experience or domains of our lives. So things like virtue, things like time, things like death. I really feel that any wisdom tradition worth its salt has got to be able to have an understanding of death. Something about practices, something about the big story we tell ourselves. And all these facets look very different when considered in the light of spiritual intelligence. So one obvious one would be the experience of time. Time tends to be controlled by chronological time these days, a very practical and useful way of thinking about time. It means that we can meet even in different countries if we fix the time right. So it's got its uses. But a spiritual interest in time is not so much interested in the tick, tick, tick of the clock, but what's the importance of the moment? Is there something that might be released in the now? And so it encourages a different focus on time, a sort of vertical experience of time rather than the horizontal tick, tick, tick of the clock. And so it's by thinking about things like time in different ways and then practicing how we experience it differently that our spiritual intelligence can be nurtured.
Right. Oh, very, very interesting. So it can be developed. And why would, perhaps I've asked this before, but why would someone want to develop their spiritual intelligence?
Yeah, well, it's related to, what we've been discussing already. If it's innate to being human, then without it, the sense of being human is going to start to thin out. I think this really matters nowadays because our world is increasingly being shaped by artificial intelligence and this very efficient, rational, pattern spotting kind of intelligence, and it's got great benefits. But the risk is that the world becomes so shaped by artificial intelligence that we kind of forget that we've got other ways of engaging with life. We kind of get out of practice, or our daily lives tend to exclude it. And so cultivating and just becoming more aware of this different way of experiencing life and engaging with things, I think is going to be increasingly important for us to remain human, in fact, and not feel that we're getting drawn more and more into a machine-like existence.
Yeah. As far as artificial intelligence and pattern spotting and pattern, manipulating, I feel like that is the heart of intelligence, noticing the patterns and putting them together in different ways. But, having someone just kind of codifying it and putting it in an artificial way is a bit frightening. And it's like, wait a minute, you're taking some of my innate intelligence here and proving that it's not just innate to me. So yeah, fair point, right? So, of course, we've got so many challenges today. So how could spiritual intelligence help us with that? COVID and war and culture wars and politics. How can spiritual intelligence help us with that?
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is I think that spiritual intelligence always becomes aware of like another dimension on problems and challenges that face us, and so brings space and room for maneuver. So take something like the pandemic, like COVID. I became very aware that certainly in the UK, the response to the pandemic was almost wholly medical. And we treated it as a great challenge to medical science, and that suffering and death, therefore, needed to be approached through medical means. And clearly, there's huge benefit in that. I don't decry that at all, but it's not enough for we human beings, because we bring anxiety and stress and concern and then existential questions, and we start asking, what's our society for, and so on. And going to the emergency room or going to a doctor with those kind of things, it just overloads health services, which we saw during the pandemic. And I think what this showed up for us is that when we haven't got other ways of negotiating, relating to, deepening our sense of suffering and death, we suffer even more because the medical science that we turn to can't deliver on that level. And so I've worked in hospitals in the UK as a psychotherapist, and it became very, very evident to me during the pandemic that doctors too are saying we need to think about death and suffering in other ways, not just by demanding cures, great as though they can be. Of course, I don't knock that. And so the meaningful side, even of death, we've become, rather poor on that, I think, in the modern world. And so I'd hope that a notion like spiritual intelligence might help us to consider that again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our history, the history of civilizations had pandemics, wars, famines, all types of things to challenge our thoughts of mortality. And we haven't had anything like that in modern memory. And having to have that come up again, it's like, well, we really need to learn this. We need to master this concept in order to evolve more fully. Wonderful answer. So, of course, in your psychotherapy practice, how do you employ spiritual intelligence? How do you use that or inform with it?
It's about how you listen often, actually. I mean, a lot of psychotherapy is about listening, and then you listen with your body and your heart as well as with your head and your empirical senses, and try and feel into where there's the energy that feels like it's got stuck, or it's trying to reveal more. Maybe this comes up in dreams, images, the way that people talk, the reactions in the room. And at one level, you listen in for where the problems might be. And so, first of all, kind of clarify the source of anxiety or the source of depression. And that can be quite liberating in itself, actually. But with spiritual intelligence, you're listening for the more. You're listening for maybe the ways that people are reaching out for a side of life that's not just about their everyday problems, but is about the greater meaning in their lives, or even more interestingly, when something perhaps a bit more eternal is experienced in the room, or when something that they feel they're receiving or maybe being called by. This can come up in dreams, when dreams aren't just a reworking of yesterday's anxieties, but seem to have a bit more of an archetypal theme. And so you listen out, watch out for that. And then the spiritual intelligence says this matters. It's not always clear the way in which it matters, but nonetheless, you do well to pay attention to it. So it's a kind of listening, perceiving with the inner eye, with the sense of the heart, beyond just pure emotion, the ups and downs, into a sort of deeper, more settled kind of felt experience.
I think this is so missing in our healthcare systems, especially the American healthcare system, which just really, and the mental health system too, is just so missing, because we can look at the biology of a plant or of an animal and we can say, okay, well, this is going on, this is how you treat it, this is how you resolve it. But we're so much more complex than that. And we need to be looking at the greater, it's so interesting, Mark, because the last episode that I recorded just today, right before you, it was on basically a guide to holistic health, but it was more than that, looked at diet, like our immune response, but also meditation, the chakra system, numerology, bringing all of these things in. We are so much more complex than just our biology. And this is so interesting.
Hi there. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to tell you about a very special event that we have coming up with Radiate Wellness. This is the Inner Journey, Discovering Your Soul's Path 3-day spiritual and metaphysical retreat. This is an immersive experience, March 31st to April 2nd. So it's all inclusive. So that's lodging, meals, snacks, and wonderful workshops. So what are the workshops that we have coming up? First, we're going to be doing a sound healing concert with Susan Walter, who's a visionary angel artist and angel communicator who paints beautiful angel portraits. And she'll be leading us in a sound healing concert with crystal bowls, and there will be energy work alongside that sound healing. We're going to be doing a group QHHT session, that is quantum healing hypnosis technique, with me, Christy, and we will visit one past life and one potential future life, just to look at the arc of your soul and your soul's purpose. We will also be connecting to your inner self and your intentions for 2023. We'll be doing energy workshops and energy healing workshops. And we will do a meditation to meet your angel or angels and learn how to work with them. We will also have a special guest from Switzerland, from Geneva, Switzerland. Mary Jane Stodeman will be joining us to talk about your soul's journey with astrology. So our leaders for this retreat are myself, Christy Clemens Hoffman, Kathy Lesmeister, who's another one of our wonderful practitioners with Radiate Wellness, Susan Walter, who is a Kansas City-based visionary artist and sound bowl enthusiast, as well as Mary Jane Stodeman, tarot master and astrology teacher. in Switzerland. So all of these events are all covered under one price. And there is an early bird special. You can save $100 on this retreat until January 31st, 2023. And then regular registration continues afterward. And again, that will be a $100 discount up until January 31st. You can find out more information and register at radiatewellnesscommunity.com. It's right at the top of the homepage. Hope to see you there.
Did you know that Radiate Wellness is more than just a podcast? That's right. We're also a comprehensive, holistic wellness practice. Find out about our services, practitioners, and upcoming events at radiatewellnesscommunity.com. While you're there, visit our podcast page to read more about our great guests and even donate to the podcast. If you like our podcast, you can help in other ways as well, like subscribe or follow us wherever you're listening right now. Tell a friend, a family member, or a coworker about the great content you find here. And if you wouldn't mind, please give us a thumbs up, a 5-star rating, or a positive review. Sounds like a small thing, but it really helps. You might like to know about our Facebook communities while we're at it. We have a free community, the Radiate Wellness Community, on Facebook for news and great free content. Our subscribers group is Radiate U, as in the letter U, but also, well, you. There you'll find curated replays of past classes, guest interviews, and more. And now, back to our podcast and back to our guest.
So without giving too much away, because I want people to read this book, I think it's important. Could we go over the 7 steps, just kind of briefly?
Yeah, well, we've touched on sort of 3 or 4 of them already, so we can bring them together. Yeah, I mean, and the first one is telling the big story of ourselves right. Because if we tell a very utilitarian kind of survival-only story, then we'll tend to think of ourselves in that way, and that tends to collapse life to a struggle or survival of the fittest. Which suits the materialist world, but doesn't suit being human. And so I think we need to tell this different big story. Homo spiritualis we are, you might say, not just Homo sapiens.
Right.
Then the second one relates to this because it's about the nature of our freedom. Again, we tend to think of freedom in rather narrow ways nowadays, as if it's just freedom of choice or freedom of expression. And those are important things, but what gets missed is what's this freedom for? And ultimately, I think that we human beings are free to align with the spiritual commons through our spiritual intelligence. And so it gives freedom a purpose, in fact, when you think about it in that way. Then the third is considering what you regard as the nature of reality. Is it just random, meaningless jumble? Or is there good evidence, as well as the insights of deep traditions, that suggest there is a coherence, there's a kind of simplicity even that runs through all things, that's really necessary when life feels like it gets more and more complex and speeds up? Can you align with a kind of inner spiritual compass that helps you navigate the everyday? That's the third. The fourth is to do with this business about therapy, church going, even kind of the new age workshops, the huge variety of work you can do on your soul, but how does the soul settle into a wider spirit? Shall I keep going?
Please.
That was number 4. And number 5 has to do with death. So thinking about the meaning of death, and all the great traditions tell us that actually death is a portal. It's not an end, but it's an end that's a new beginning. And so how can we know something about that, not so much just at the end, but practice that in our lives even? Then thinking about virtue. And the point about virtue is that it's not just that we behave well, but that it helps us to become more open to reality and to resonate with reality more and more. So, for example, I think of humility not as putting yourself last, but putting yourself in the position that, like the sea, into which everything can flow, so the whole of life can flow into you. It's a kind of quality of openness. So it's thinking about those. And then finally, the seventh step is to do with time and thinking about this kairos time, as it's sometimes put, or eternity, and not just chronos time.
Right. Okay, fascinating. And it really does, I'm getting such a bigger picture of spiritual intelligence and what it is, because it does go into every aspect of our reality, which is something I wanted to, I was thinking about with step 4 is, with step 3, seeing reality is simple, and the role of the quantum in that. In my faith, which is unity, which was founded here in the Kansas City area, and now it's a worldwide movement. But one of our principles, one of our 5 basic principles, is that we create our reality with our thoughts and beliefs. What would you say is the role of the quantum in thoughts and beliefs in spiritual intelligence?
Well, I did a physics degree actually at one point as an undergraduate, and one of the things that really struck me about particularly the early founders of quantum theory. And when you say quantum, you're thinking about quantum theory.
Right. Yes, of course.
Yeah, just check. Yeah. Well, they started to realize that reality was stranger than the traditional physics had accounted for. And actually, when they were trying to understand this strangeness, as well as doing the maths and doing the experiments and so on, many of the great early founders of quantum theory were deeply informed by mystical traditions. Figures like Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Dirac, even Einstein in his own way was informed by a kind of mystical Judaism. Mm. And they used those traditions in order to try to understand the physics. That, I think, is why the new physics seems so commensurate with mystical traditions. It's not so much that physicists are proving matters of spirit, but that matters of spirit can illuminate the physics. And so I find that very fascinating.
Yes, the physics illuminates the spiritual, right? I mean, they don't have to be mutually exclusive at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, it is one reality, and there's a huge sort of tendency or intuition that reality must add up in some way. Science works on this premise. Physics is related to chemistry, is related to biology. The assumption is that whilst it can get very complex at any particular level, it adds up to something coherent. And that too is a spiritual perception. It's very closely associated, particularly with monotheistic traditions, of course, where there can be many manifestations of the divine, but they're all manifestations of the one divine.
Right. Okay. So, theistic traditions. What do you feel is the role of the God, the figurehead, in spiritual intelligence?
So, I think that God is both transcendent, but also deeply immanent. It's both things at the same time. So, there is a God that is, as it were, the origin, the source, the wellspring continually of the cosmos, of creation. And the divine presence, therefore, is sort of bigger than the cosmic reality because it's the origin of that. But because the divine is also a wellspring or a source, the divine is also present in every single part of that cosmos. As some mystics put it, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. And spiritual intelligence, therefore, is aware of the divine presence most imminently within us, as well as most splendidly without. And it's both aspects that I think spiritual intelligence understands and can see how that's not actually a contradiction, but comes together.
Okay, this is very interesting. I could talk about this all day long. So, what do you hope readers get out of this book?
I hope it's a book that, at one level, helps people just tune in a bit more in their own experience to the nature of the spiritual commons, partly quite practically in terms of the everyday, but also more culturally and socially, because I think that we need to understand these things much better at the collective level as well as at the individual level. It's very hard to live a coherent life when in one moment you're in a sort of spiritual zone and then the next moment in a very material zone. And it's part, I think, of the sense of feeling fragmented and alienated from life. So it's a book, you might say, that does do some telling, but I hope does as much showing by telling these stories, by exploring what a variety of spiritual adepts have said from across many traditions, in fact, but also telling the stories of some people's lives and drawing on my own experience as well.
Interesting. And so, do you think an atheist, for example, would get something out of this book and the notion of spiritual intelligence in the first place?
Yeah, an atheist could. The person who probably couldn't is the very strict scientific materialist. The person that really thinks that physics
is the
beginning and end, as it were, of all descriptions of reality. They're clearly not going to like the idea of spiritual intelligence. But there's this new category of the knowns that statisticians talk about a lot. The no particular religion, the spiritual but not religious, that's a growing proportion of society, both in the US and in the UK. And many people in that category, whilst maybe even saying they're atheistic, do have a spiritual sense. They realize that their inner lives are more than just hormones and neurons firing. Meaning is not described by hormones and neurons, and there's something else going on as well. So I hope that spiritual intelligence is a broader interest for many people.
Right, because it's really just it's the search for meaning in many different ways. And hopefully even people who are just strictly science-based will have some curiosity about the meaning behind everything. Very fascinating. So you've got this website I'm looking at. It's markvernon.com, and you've got so many blog articles and other articles, upcoming events. Do you have anything else on the horizon that you want to talk about?
Well, I'm talking about spiritual intelligence. I mean, I have a YouTube channel as well, and try to put talks and thoughts up on that, conversations with others, a bit like you do as well. And I'm particularly interested in the moment in William Blake. I live in South London, and William Blake is our local mystic. And so understanding what William Blake was going on about, I think, might really matter now as well. So someone who clearly had spiritual intelligence, but what did it tell him? And why did he produce the poetry and the art that he did as a result?
I mean, the same could be studied with any artist, any writer, any playwright, musician, composer. So this is a never-ending topic. In fact, I was just involved this past summer with an art exhibition. It's called The Great Gossamer of 2022. Of course, it was originally supposed to be The Great Gossamer of 2020, but we know what happened. And this was an art exhibition of the nexus, the space between art and spirituality. And I was invited to come and give an address on that. And there was also an astrologer who gave an address, and various mystics, a shaman, And so various people coming to talk about that, and many of the artists had near-death experiences and the spirituality behind that. I mean, this is a deep topic that touches about every aspect of our life.
Yeah, so bringing together these different experiences and asking, what do they suggest about the nature of reality? What are the sort of experiential common threads, but can we, with this more intuitive or inspirational, imaginative capacity that we have, start to connect to reality in different ways, so that they're not just peak experiences or strange experiences or moments that we hope to return to, but can become a reality that, for example, the artist can convey, and so help us to live with it day by day, not just rather randomly as and when it, sort of seems to show up.
Interesting. Now, this might seem like an off-the-wall question, but it just popped into my head. How can we bring more spiritual intelligence to religion? It's especially the way the religion tends to be done here in the United States, very evangelical, very literal interpretations of the Bible. How can we sprinkle some more spiritual intelligence into this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge even in the UK, where many fewer people go to church, but nonetheless, the way often church shows up in the UK actually is that it's got a great social concern. So it's very preoccupied with questions of justice, which clearly are important and good questions to ask. But it's surprising how little there is on, say, personal development in UK church going. And I think that this sort of sense that religion's mostly about moral concerns, and with all these kind of red lines in the sand, this is a reduction of the spiritual to the moral, and it makes people feel a bit more safe or secure, because you can say this is right, that's wrong, and as long as you're more or less doing what's right, you can feel you're on the right side of your religion. And so in a very unsettled and uncertain world, I think that's why particularly these moral certainties are kind of really sought and preached, and offered to people. But the trouble is that they're abstractions from life. Life is always more complicated than any particular moral scheme can tell you, useful though it might be. And so spiritual intelligence is about becoming more open to reality as it comes to us, as it confuses us, as it disturbs us, as well as it delights us. And so I would say to people, of course, go to church. I go to church myself, but don't just, as it were, follow the program. Ask yourself, what am I experiencing here? What do I yearn for here? What feels like it can't be brought into this space? And all those extra elements might take you, more closely to your humanity as actually lived, rather than as you feel it should be lived or ought to be lived, or is lived when it's sieved of that which isn't acceptable to one religion or another.
Fascinating. Again, I could talk about this subject all day long. Is there anything that you feel we haven't covered? Anything that you would hope our listeners would take away from this discussion that we haven't discussed yet?
I mean, we've talked about a lot, for which thanks. I guess that part of the hope from my book is that it does weave together both personal perception and practice, but also what's coming out of the quarters of science, even evolutionary science, which is sometimes seen as antithetical to religion. There's a much richer story going on, I think, in these domains. And by just searching it out that little bit more than perhaps you might read in the average newspaper, you start to see that notions like spiritual intelligence are not at loggerheads with the modern world, but are part and parcel, I think, of who we can be and what we might be becoming.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, to me, it's living our living life in a more connected and intentional way. And, for me, the spiritual informs every single aspect of my life. So
Yeah, no, just trying something small out, like, lighting a candle or bowing to something. These small embodied gestures can make a huge difference. You feel the world opening up before you.
fascinating. All right, so I need to have you back on again. So I hope you can have some time in your schedule to sit down and talk again, because there's so much to discuss and bring to light. Mark Vernon, thank you so much for joining me today. This is wonderful. The website again is markvernon.com. And the book again is, pulling up the title here, Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. It really is that simple, but also that vast. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Hey, look, thank you for inviting me on. It's been very nice to talk.
Radiate Wellness is an international community of holistic and alternative healers dedicated to helping you create spiritual, energetic, and physical well-being. To learn more about our practitioners, services, classes, and events, or to schedule an appointment, visit us at radiatewellnesscommunity.com.